Hello there, today I thought I would talk to you about the audiobooks I listened to in August. I didn't listen to a great deal this month because I had a week off where I didn't listen to anything, and I've also been kind of enjoying dabbling with things like music and things like that, just to kind of give myself days off from audiobooks. Sometimes it's quite nice because I listen to audiobooks sort of intermittently while I'm working, and then obviously I spend the evenings reading. Sometimes it just gets a bit much and it's kind of nice to just listen to music. I've also started a few audiobooks this month and not gotten along with them. One of them, for example, was Fern Cotton's Happy, I think it's called, or Be Happy. Far too many references for referring to attachments and things. I think I took it out for a walk with me, and literally about 9 times she referred me to the accompanying material, and you know, when I listen to an audiobook I like to take it out with me, so that didn't work for me. So as a result of all of that, long story short, I've only read 3 audiobooks. Let's get straight into it. The first one was Everybody Lies, and I know I'm going to get this name wrong, by Seth Stevens-Davidowitch, I think that is, narrated by Christopher Rayland. This book is going to be quite difficult to describe. Basically what I thought it was going into it was that it looked at what our Google research results tell us about what we tell ourselves or our friends or our family compared to what we tell ourselves, and that is an aspect of this book, but it kind of goes way further than that and looks at big data on the whole. So what our search results or our buying habits or just anything can tell a company about who we are, what we actually want compared to what we say we want. So this looks at things like, it does look at our Google results, and it looks at how, for example, our Google results reflect that actually more often than not, for instance, women who say that they have a lot of sex do not actually have a lot of sex, and more often than not, also interestingly, it's often women who have issues with their boyfriends not wanting to have sex. And it also looks at things like the sales of condoms compared to how much we think we buy condoms to how much we actually buy condoms, which also links in with the sex thing. It's not all sex stuff. There's also aspects about things like companies like Facebook, how they use algorithms, how they use big data, which is quite interesting because obviously it's such a volatile topic at the moment. It's something that people are very worried about and people are bothered about, but ultimately, you know, this book looks at the fact that Facebook is not the only company by any means that use big data, and ultimately they are using big data to give us an experience that we want, we just don't admit to ourselves that we want. So for instance, something like Facebook, you know, we tell ourselves that we don't want to know every detail of our friends' lives, we tell ourselves that we respect people's privacy, and yet we all love this chance to just snoop on each other, to see each other's every little intimacies, and how big people in business are cashing in on that and realising that, you know, sometimes what we tell ourselves is not actually the truth. I really enjoyed this book. I think, as you can probably tell, it's a very interesting book. It looks at some really interesting and also relevant topics. I think something like this with algorithms and things, people are worried about it, and I think it's really interesting to get a closer look into that and how it's actually used to help companies shape their business models. Ultimately, I think this book kind of is not the longest book. I mean, listening to the audiobook, I think it was only about 9 hours, which is pretty standard. So it's probably about a 400-page book, 350 maybe. And there is a lot in there. It kind of tries to cover all the bases when it comes to big data. And I feel like that is too big a subject to cover in one little book. And I feel like that definitely comes across that we don't necessarily always get the links. For example, there's a point where the author goes off topic, I would say, and sort of talks about the fact that the reason we smile in pictures is because Kodak developed a marketing campaign where people were smiling in pictures. Before that, it was kind of serious poses like you would hold if you were posing for a portrait, say, which is a really interesting fact, and it's something that I didn't know and that I'm glad that I know. But I couldn't really see what that had to do with the book as a whole. I think there was definitely some points in here where it could have been done with narrowing down on one subject. I think what I would have liked for this is that it is solely focused on, for instance, Google searches, and then perhaps bring out another book which looks at things like Facebook algorithms. that would have probably worked better for me, but I would still recommend this. I think there is some really interesting pointers in there. I think it would probably also kind of put a lot of people's minds at ease in terms of what companies do with the data that they get. There's also a lot in here about surveys, and even anonymous surveys, and how people lie on anonymous surveys because they want to make themselves feel better. It is full of fascinating information. As I say, it just could have done with paring down and focusing more on certain topics. Then I listened to Moral Disorder by Margaret Atwood, narrated by Lorelei King. This I did not like at all. It was probably my least favourite Margaret Atwood, and I think there are a few different factors to that, and it's not necessarily a reflection on the book. Basically, this is marketed as a short story collection which focuses on sort of, it's kind of an interwoven short story collection. It focuses on one woman's life, and we focus on her life from, we see different stories based on when she's a child all the way through to when she is in her old age. The issue I had with this firstly was that I went into it thinking it was a short story collection because that's how it's marketed. It's not a short story collection, in the fact that these stories do not at all stand on their own in any way, shape or form. If you got one of these stories just on its own, you would just be left thinking, what? If you're going to market something as a short story collection, it has to be a short story collection. The stories, even though they're interwoven, have to stand apart as short stories, and these stories do not. So kind of about halfway through, I just scrapped the idea of it being a short story collection and tried to listen to it as just a straight out book. That also kind of didn't work because there's no real... This reads almost, and I'm really bad saying this because it's Margaret Atwood, but it reads almost like vignettes or little scraps that, you know, when you're writing a novel, you write sort of little scraps. You write prime scenes that you know that you want to get to, and then you kind of fill in between them. I feel like this was those key scenes, but Margaret Atwood hadn't done the work of filling in the gaps between. It was just not good. I don't know whether it was because I was listening to it, and admittedly I think as soon as I started listening to it I realised it was a mistake, because Margaret Atwood has stunning language. She is really fantastic with language, but she's also very dense, and even reading her it can sometimes be quite, you can kind of zone out a bit at times. That was very much the case with this, and I think because I was listening to it I didn't get that beautiful language that I love so much about Margaret Atwood. There were some points that were obviously stunning, and it's well written in the general sense, but I think as a whole thing it just didn't work for me at all. About 2 hours in I was kind of thinking, should I just stop listening? The only reason I carried on listening to the end was because I felt bad for having wasted 2 hours on it. Yeah, I didn't like this at all. I will not be listening to any more Margaret Atwood in audio format, but I also, from looking at the reviews, even people who have read the physical copy didn't really get this. So I don't know whether it was just rushed through marketing and it was kind of taken when it wasn't quite ready to be published. I don't know. It was really bizarre, and I really didn't enjoy it at all. Then I finished with The Girl with the Lower Back Tattoo by Amy Schumer, narrated by Amy Schumer. Now, I don't know much about Amy Schumer, but I know she's an American comedian. She's been in a film that was released here recently. I can't remember what it's called, and I think she has her own show in America called The Amy Schumer Show, I think. The reason I got this is because I've heard quite a few people talk about this in audio format specifically, saying that they didn't like Amy Schumer or didn't really know Amy Schumer, but they still enjoyed the audio. I was also drawn to this because she narrates it herself, and I think memoirs and non-fictions that are narrated by the author are so much more impactful, and I think it was on for like $1.99 one day, so I bought it, and I really enjoyed this actually. As I say, I don't know anything about Amy Schumer, and from listening to her narration I think she probably has done some controversial things, and she sounds like she's not afraid to confront things and to call people out when they're making her feel uncomfortable. She's quite a feminist figure. She kind of sticks up for the women, and you know, in her, obviously as a female comedian, she's had to deal with quite a lot of sexist comments. So from listening to this I can understand why some people might think she's a bit loud and confrontational. However, I think every instance where she confronted someone was absolutely apt and fair. Ultimately, this was quite fun and just good. I think even if you don't know who Amy Schumer is, because I didn't really, this is just a nice book about being a woman. I mean, it starts with a note to her vagina, and she's sort of apologising for all the bad things she's done to it, all the cotton underwear she's worn and things like that, and that's kind of a good base to go on with this. Amy Schumer talks about everything from sexual abuse to her own sexual experiences to how she has come to be comfortable in her body. things like that. And it's just, I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I didn't find anything not to like about this. I was a bit worried because I thought it might be a little bit like Tina Fey's Bossy Pants, which I didn't enjoy at all. I thought it was just, I didn't feel like Tina Fey was being genuine in that book, whereas I think Amy Schumer has completely put everything out there in this book. She's not hidden anything, she's not painted herself in a better light, you know, she's openly admitted when she's made mistakes or when she's been an idiot. Ultimately, the only thing I would say negative about this is that it does what a lot of celeb memoirs do, in that it just jumps about in terms of time. So there is kind of a chronological order to it of types, but ultimately we do jump from like one relationship to a relationship she had when she was a child, which impacted that relationship that she was talking about before. I think celebrities do this a lot in terms of that they go from one story to another. They kind of tell it like a conversation, which is probably a specific choice that they've made, and I understand why. It kind of pulls the reader in and makes it feel like just having a chat with a friend. But for me, I would prefer to have a straight out chronology in something like this. I just think it would be easier to see, you know, how things led on to each other, because I don't think we need to have that conversation of this bad relationship, which is a result of this bad relationship. If we had things in the order that they came, we would automatically make those assumptions ourselves. I don't know, it kind of jars me a little bit when I think I'm into the narrative and I'm into the time frame, and then suddenly we're back with Amy when she was like 15. It didn't do it overly a lot. I think this is much better for that than other books that I've listened to or read. But that is one slight niggle. But other than that, I would highly recommend this. I think it's really good for female empowerment. It's really good for body empowerment, and just is generally good for a giggle. So yeah, please let me know down below if you've been listening to any good books this month, and I will see you next time. Bye.